Hello everyone and welcome to another casual review. Today I'm talking about Final Fantasy V Pixel Remaster. Final Fantasy V is often the forgotten Final Fantasy of the Super Nintendo trilogy. I think one of the reasons for that is it did not initially make its way to America like Final Fantasy IV and VI did. However, I feel that Final Fantasy V brings a lot to the table, mostly its really in-depth job and combat system. We start the game as main character Bart and his chocobo when a meteor crashes nearby. And meteors are going to be a common theme throughout this game. Basically, these meteors are crashing on Bart's world, and these meteors have mysterious properties, and they have unique elements about them that play into the story later. One of the interesting things about this meteor is a man actually crawls out of it. Bart does not realize this initially, and this man has amnesia. His name is Galuf, or Galuf. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. He's probably my favorite character in this Final Fantasy game. I won't spoil his backstory, but it is integral to the main plot of Final Fantasy V. Later, we meet Princess Lena and a pirate named Faris, or Faris. In typical Final Fantasy fashion, these four set out to protect the four crystals of the different elements against main antagonist X-Death. I like that we encounter X-Death quite frequently. I like a good Final Fantasy antagonist that shows up at key moments to fight and turn the story into pivotal moments. However, I don't find him as memorable or interesting as the antagonist in Final Fantasy IV. And I think that's a common complaint about Final Fantasy V is it doesn't exactly have the amazing storytelling that is Final Fantasy IV or Final Fantasy VI. That's not to say that Final Fantasy V doesn't have a unique story or an interesting one for that matter, but in terms of character development and growth, and these characters constantly leaving your party and joining and sacrificing themselves, this game doesn't really have that. For the most part, the four characters that you start out with are the four characters that you end with, and they rarely leave your party aside from a couple of exceptions. What this does have over Final Fantasy IV and VI, though, is its unique character customization. Yes, you are going to be playing as Bart, but you can choose what job Bart has. It brings back the job system from Final Fantasy III, and it vastly improves on it. In fact, I think this is the best job system in any Final Fantasy game that comes to mind. Just like in Final Fantasy III, it starts you out with a set amount of jobs, and then as you progress through the story, you will unlock more and more jobs. You do have more incentive to stick to a particular job, though, because as you increase a job's level, you permanently unlock different abilities that you can carry over to other jobs. And so there's a unique system of like mixing and matching. If you master, let's say, a white mage spell and then carry it over to a warrior, then suddenly you built your own like custom paladin. There are also unique passive effects too as you level up your jobs. And so initially I set out to have 3 spellcasters. Bart's was kind of like my summoner, and then I had Lena be my black mage, and I had Galuf be my white mage, and then I had Faris be like almost like my warrior melee type character. But at the end of the game, you know, once you master these jobs, there's little incentive to stick with these jobs because you're basically going to be wasting that job experience. And so you're kind of forced, especially at the end game, to mix and match different jobs and really play around with its systems. By the end of the game, there's a job called a mimic, and mimics are kind of unique because you can carry over like 3 different abilities from 3 different jobs, and so you can really mix and match and build your character exactly how you want them to be depending on like what kind of situation you are encountering. That's another thing that I really like about the combat in this game, especially late game, is a lot of the encounters feel like puzzles. You know, there's gimmicks almost to like every boss that you're going to encounter, and once you understand the parameters or the rules for this boss, you have to decide how you're going to overcome that boss under these constraints. And so it almost feels like a puzzle in a way. You can't necessarily brute force your way through every single encounter. You have to play by the rules. And so it's like, here's the puzzle. These are the pieces that you you have unlocked, how are you going to solve this puzzle? And it's cool because no matter what playthrough or who's playing it, all of the pieces are going to look different depending on like what abilities they've had their parties master and what jobs they are currently using and what type of equipment that they currently have. I mean, it's definitely not the type of game where you can just auto battle your way all the way to the end, especially that late game, because late game, some of these enemies hit hard and you really need to think about what abilities are you bringing to the table and what equipment are you wearing. This time around, I found that it wasn't actually that beneficial to use the optimal equipped setting where it automatically assigns like whatever the strongest and most defensive gear is. There's a lot of gear like ribbons or golden hairpins, I think it's called, that like reduce the amount of MP that I use, and so you really are wanting to look into those additional effects that equipments bring. There were occasionally I would encounter a couple bosses that would just hit me with a ton of like water spells, and so I needed to go in and change my equipment so I would resist or absorb water spells. Another thing that I like about the jobs is they all feel very unique, but they also, for the most part, feel pretty powerful in their own way. There are a couple jobs where you just go buy the spells, like the white mage and the black mage and time mage is in this one. And the cool thing about our spells is once you unlock the spell, everybody knows that spell. The cool thing about this is the unique introduction to blue mages. And the idea of blue mages is if you get hit by a certain spell from an enemy, you now learn that spell or ability. And the other cool thing about this is if one person learns that blue magic spell, then everybody uses that blue magic spell. And so I really wanted to dive into the blue mage system because typically I ignore the blue mage and just stick with what's comfortable for me. And so I actually set out to get all of the blue mage abilities. Obviously, you have to follow a guide. The frustrating thing about blue mages is it's not like any ability or spell that an opponent uses on you is learned. It's like a specific set list of abilities that you can learn from enemies. And so I did follow a guide to do that. And then I always go out to unlock every summon in the Final Fantasy games because summons are my favorite classes and jobs. And so I did that and every blue mage attack. And so I probably spent a lot longer than I needed to playing through this game by going through and getting all the summons and the blue spells. And to be honest, I probably didn't use the majority of those blue abilities and those summons that I set out to unlock, but it was satisfying to get all of them. And like from a completionist standpoint, there is a ton of additional side content for you to explore and unlock. One of them being like the 12 legendary weapons that you can do. There's secret super bosses that you can go try and take down. It's a lot more open than something that's linear like Final Fantasy IV. It's kind of interesting actually how they went about navigation and unlocking what areas you can go to, because there's like 3 times, without giving away too many spoilers, there's like 3 segments in the game where you basically have to start from scratch and then you slowly unlock like a new vehicle or a mode of transportation, and then you suddenly have these additional areas for unlock, and then you basically like have your whole access to this world, and then it resets, and then you have to start back from scratch and slowly unlock access to the whole world, and then it resets again. I did have to pull up the guide a couple more times than I did in Final Fantasy IV just because of its open worldness. Yes, you could probably go around and talk to the villagers and they'll give you hints as to where to go next, but that's not typically how I like to play my RPGs. So yeah, a couple times I needed to pull out a guide. For the most part, it was fairly obvious where I needed to go next, but like especially late game, it kind of opens up where it's kind of like choose what you want to do next. And so that at that point I did need to pull up a guide, and I did need to reference the guide quite often when I was playing against some of these end game bosses to see like, okay, what are these bosses vulnerable to? What type of magic are they going to be casting on me? And really helping me game out a strategy based on what I can use against the boss. Really, I think my main complaint about the superior job system that is in Final Fantasy V is the appearance of the characters. Now, one thing that is cool is your characters don't all look the same if you're all playing as the same job. Like, they all have their own unique black mage sprite, or white mage, or blue mage, or whatever. For the majority, most of these jobs look pretty goofy, and it's difficult for me to take them seriously. Now, there are some cooler looking ones than others, but for the majority, I'm like, that's kind of a silly looking sprite for this job. The 10 spots are back from Final Fantasy IV. There are the occasional, like, talk to this urn to revive your HP and MP, or go to this healing spring, but for the most part, when you're navigating through these dungeons, you will be relying on these tent spots. But don't worry, tents and cottages are plentiful and cheap, and so, at least in my opinion, because I had 3 spellcasters, just use your strongest spells over and over again, and more often than not, you will be able to navigate your way to a tent spot. Besides, like, that last dungeon, you are really stretching out your MP in between these 10 spots. But because I'm playing the Pixel Remaster, if you do run out of MP, I can kind of cheese it and turn off encounters and run back to my previous 10 spot in order to revive that MP. And so it was really fun, especially late game, to just use my strongest summons, and I'm throwing my flares and my holies and my Bahamut's and all sorts of crazy stuff, and I felt super powerful. And one of the cheesier strategies that I used when I was just navigating through dungeons is this job class that I talked about earlier, the Mimics. They have the ability to mimic what was previously done by a teammate. So if I just have my summoner use Bahamut, then I can just mimic all the Bahamuts after that, and so I'm just constantly casting this Mega Flare ability. But like I mentioned earlier, this strategy doesn't necessarily work for all bosses, because they all kind of have their own rules and reactions. Tonally, it is more lighthearted than Final Fantasy IV. You can tell from the beginning when you just start listening to the OST of this game. It's a lot more lighthearted, upbeat. Actually, the soundtrack reminds me a lot of Neverending Story, and I'm kind of here for it. But even just the way that the characters like animate and emote, their eyes get all huge, and they shake their head, and they jump up in the air with joy, right? They're a lot more expressive than Final Fantasy IV, and they also throw in a lot more jokes. I think at one time there was a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle reference in the game, and so it's more lighthearted. That's not to say that, like, Exdeath isn't this dangerous presence and he isn't, like, trying to destroy the world or anything like that, but Final Fantasy IV is bleak compared to Final Fantasy V. Piano skills make a return from previous Final Fantasy games, and I set out to master all the different pianos, so by the end I was really good at that. Moogles also make a return, and they play a major plot point at a couple different times. We have our first introduction of Mid relative to Cid. Now, Mid in this game is male. In future Final Fantasy games, Mid is usually like Cid's hot granddaughter in like Final Fantasy 15. I think that's what her position was. And then I think Mid is Cid's daughter in Final Fantasy 16. They also introduce one of my other favorite characters, Gilgamesh, who is kind of like the Deadpool of Final Fantasy. Like, he makes a lot of different appearances in future Final Fantasy games as well, usually as like summons or boss battles, but he was like a reoccurring enemy, and it kind of turns from enemy to somebody who actually respects you. Time-wise, this game is a lot longer than its previous 4 games. It took me 21-ish hours to beat. I didn't go out to complete everything, like I said. I didn't do all the optional super difficult bosses. I didn't get all of the legendary weapons or all of the bard songs, but I did get like all the blue spells and the summons, and I tried to do the majority of like the interesting content, at least in my opinion. And so maybe that extended the gameplay a little bit, but most of the Final Fantasies that I've played up to this point, at least for the Pixel Remaster collection, take maybe 12-ish hours. So we're looking at like almost double the completion time to play through this game and roll the credits, at least in my experience, which would normally be fine, but I do have a couple other games burning a hole in my pocket, and so I was getting maybe a little impatient, which isn't fair to Final Fantasy V. It's not Final Fantasy V's fault that I have other games that I want to play. It just is more of a time commitment than its predecessors. But I really had a great time playing this game. I loved experimenting with the job system, and I feel like in the hands of somebody who really can pick apart the mechanics of this game and can go into this game with like a plan, you could totally min-max your way through this game and just destroy anything you encounter. There's a lot of different ways that you can cheese this game if you understand its mechanics. By the end boss that I'm fighting, I actually kind of resorted to a pay-to-win mechanic where I think it's the samurai. The samurai has an ability called Zenniage where you basically just throw your money at the enemies and it does a ton of damage, and like whatever, I'm facing the final boss, so just tossing all my gold at the final boss was so fun, and it did so much damage, and it's literally like a pay-to-win mechanic in this game, which is just hilarious. But there's like I mentioned, the mimic technique, like there's a ton of different ways you can kind of cheese this game if you understand the mechanics of it, which I love. I love that it's just such this deep combat system that you can really sink your teeth into and spend hours grinding with meaningful rewards. So for those reasons, I will be giving this game a 5 out of 5. It's a shame that this game does not receive the recognition that it deserves, because like honestly, one of the best combat systems in a Final Fantasy game that I've played. Well, that's 5 out of 6 Final Fantasy games done for the Pixel Remaster. I'm having a great time. In most people's opinions, the best is saved for last with Final Fantasy VI, which a lot of people consider one of the, if not the best Final Fantasy game. And so I am excited to sink my teeth into Final Fantasy VI. I just have a couple other games that have been burning a hole in my pocket, like I mentioned earlier. So I will get to Final Fantasy VI as soon as I have cleared up some of the backlog. Well, guys, that's it for me. Let me know if you have any questions or comments about Final Fantasy V Pixel Remaster, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later. Bye!